In the spring of 1976, a foam contractor named David B. South stood in a frozen potato field in Shelley, Idaho, about to do something that convinced his neighbors he had completely lost his mind. He fired up a bank of powerful industrial fans, inflated an enormous fabric balloon until it stood nearly as large as a barn, then crawled inside carrying a spray gun. For hours, while cold winds swept across the Idaho plains, David coated the inside of that balloon with thick layers of polyurethane foam and liquid concrete. He waited for the material to cure, then removed the balloon. What remained was not a tent. It was not a shed. It was one continuous, solid shell, so structurally tough that even hitting it with a heavy-duty pickup truck wouldn't simply knock it down. The local potato farmers laughed. They called it a monstrosity. But decades later, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, examined that same basic shape, studied the physics behind it, and gave it the highest level of building safety recognition possible, near absolute protection. It was rated to withstand winds reaching 250 miles per hour. That is EF5 tornado territory, the kind of storm capable of turning a conventional timber-framed American house into a field of broken lumber and scattered debris. And yet, this is where the idea becomes almost unbelievable. The structure needs no conventional lumber frame, no complicated roof trusses, no shingles waiting to be ripped away by the next storm, no drywall to collect moisture and harbor mold, no structural wood for termites to consume. And if you approach the project correctly, there may be no 30-year mortgage hanging over your head either. This is a shape so simple that a 9-year-old can draw it without thinking. A dome, and a small version, a microdome, can be so inexpensive that the raw structural shell may be built with roughly $2,000 worth of materials. Now compare that with the other side of the housing equation. The median American home price has climbed into the range of roughly $414,900 to $440,000. And by the time you sign that 30-year mortgage, make payment after payment, and finally own the house outright, you may have handed the bank more than $500,000 in interest alone. Think about the contrast. Nearly $1 million over time for a wooden box that can rot, burn, leak, or blow apart, versus roughly $2,000 for the raw shell of a structure made from trapped air, foam, and concrete. That enormous difference is not simply an innocent accident of the marketplace. There are lumber producers, large developers, appraisers, commercial lenders, and local zoning systems that all depend on conventional housing remaining conventional. Welcome to Survival Roots. Today, we're opening the archive on the $2,000 microdome. We're going to explore the remarkable physics behind this shape, why the conventional housing world spent decades keeping structures like it away from ordinary neighborhoods, and most importantly, how people have used these ideas to build differently, step outside the machine, and move closer to independence. Part 1. The Magic of Curves. Why an egg beats a box. Let me begin with an experiment you've probably seen before, but may never have connected to the house you sleep in every night. Take an ordinary egg, place it in your hand, and squeeze it firmly from end to end. Surprisingly, it can be extremely difficult to break. That strength doesn't come from a thick shell. It doesn't come from heavy material. It comes from geometry. In a curved structure, pressure has fewer places to concentrate. Instead of collecting at one weak seam, the force moves around the curve and spreads itself across the surface. Now compare that with the ordinary suburban house. It's a box, a collection of flat walls connected by corners. When hurricane-force winds or a tornado strike a flat wall, the wind doesn't simply glide around it. It pushes against that entire surface, transferring enormous lateral forces into the structure. And the corners become natural points of weakness, where the roof joins the wall, where the wall meets the foundation, where one flat plane connects with another. Those are the places where stress gathers. A powerful storm often doesn't destroy a house by crushing it straight down. It pries it apart. Wind catches an exposed edge, works underneath shingles or eaves, and begins peeling the structure open. A square fights the weather. A circle allows much of that weather to move around it. This principle is not new. In June 1954, visionary inventor Buckminster Fuller received U.S. patent number 2,682,235 for what became known as the geodesic dome. Fuller understood that by connecting a network of lightweight triangles, you could enclose an enormous volume while using remarkably little surface area and material. The military recognized the value almost immediately. The Marine Corps hired Fuller to develop portable shelters light enough to be transported beneath helicopters and deployed into some of the most remote and demanding places on Earth. They described it as the first major improvement in mobile military structures in 2,600 years. Across Fuller's lifetime, more than 300,000 of his domes were eventually built around the world. But the geodesic dome had one major complication. It relied on thousands of triangles, and every triangle created joints. Those joints required hubs, bolts, connections, and sealants. If even one important seal failed, water could find its way inside. That is where David B. South's simplification becomes so important. South made his living insulating enormous agricultural potato storage buildings. When he looked at Fuller's complicated network of triangles, he saw something ingenious, but also something too complicated, too vulnerable to leakage, and too expensive for many ordinary builders. So he asked an almost childishly simple question. Why assemble thousands of individual pieces when you could inflate one enormous balloon, coat the inside with foam and concrete, allow it to harden, and end up with a single monolithic shell? No thousands of seams, no forest of joints, no obvious weak points. In many ways, it was one of humanity's oldest structural ideas combined with modern materials. The Romans used dome geometry when they built the Pantheon almost 1,900 years ago. That enormous structure still stands today after centuries of earthquakes, conflict, and weather, despite having no modern steel reinforcement in its famous concrete dome. Ancient Nubian builders used related curved forms thousands of years ago, creating mud brick vaults that survived in harsh desert environments. So the question becomes unavoidable. If curves have worked for thousands of years, why did modern housing become so obsessed with wooden boxes? Part 2. Aircrete and high-tech polymers, alchemical ingredients of the $2,000 shell. If you want to understand how a dome can cost so little while still functioning like a serious shelter, you have to understand the materials behind the idea. Modern DIY dome construction has evolved into three major branches, and each uses a very different material strategy. Let's begin with one of the best-known materials in the off-grid DIY world, Aircrete. Aircrete is not ordinary heavy concrete. It is a lightweight cellular concrete, created by mixing Portland cement and water with a dense foam containing millions of microscopic sealed bubbles. One of the major figures behind the modern DIY version of this approach is Hajar Gibran, founder of Domegaya in 2014. His contribution was taking a process that seemed industrial and putting it within reach of ordinary builders. Domegaya developed portable equipment such as the Dragon XL foam generator, priced around $499, along with foam injection mixers costing roughly $246. Their ultimate builder bundle, priced around $1,495, includes the foam generator, mixer, a metal tubing bender used for doors and arches, and architectural plans. Making Aircrete can look surprisingly similar to mixing an enormous batch of cake batter. A typical mixture starts with one 94-pound bag of Type 1/2 Portland cement, combined with approximately 6.8 gallons of water. Using the Dragon XL at an initial air pressure around 100 psi, foam is then injected into the cement slurry. Domegaya recommends a mixture around 1 part synthetic foaming agent, such as Aircrete S, to 55 parts water. The target foam density is around 38 grams per liter. Once everything is mixed, the resulting material is described as roughly 98% trapped air and only 2% cement. That makes it dramatically lighter than conventional concrete. A block that might normally weigh around 38 pounds can weigh only about 6 pounds in Aircrete form. It can even float. You can cut it with a handsaw, shape it with a rasp, and drive nails into it. But its biggest advantage is thermal performance. Those millions of tiny bubbles remain trapped and relatively motionless inside the material, turning Aircrete into an effective insulator. A 7-inch wall can provide an insulation value of roughly R28. That can exceed the insulation performance of many conventional stick-built walls. And unlike fiberglass insulation that can sag, collect moisture, or lose performance over time, the trapped air inside the concrete does not compress in the same way. But Aircrete is only the first path. If mixing concrete doesn't appeal to you, the second major option is the fiberglass composite dome. A well-known example is the Intershelter Dome 20. Originally designed for remote deployment, disaster relief, and severe environments, these domes use strong polyester fiberglass composite panels. A standard 20-foot dome provides approximately 314 square feet of floor area beneath a 12-foot-high ceiling, leaving enough vertical room for something like a compact sleeping loft. The full structure consists of 21 curved panels shaped almost like enormous orange peels. And because those panels arrive ready to assemble, 3 people with no specialized training can reportedly put the structure together in only 2 or 3 hours, using basic tools such as a screwdriver and wrench. At around $11,950 retail, or roughly $9,500 for certain humanitarian projects, the result is a portable, flat-packed shelter designed to withstand winds approaching 200 miles per hour, carry enormous snow loads, and remain functional for decades with minimal maintenance. Then there is the third approach, the high-density polyethylene, or HDPE, modular dome. Companies such as South Korea's Wisdom helped popularize this concept. Instead of casting concrete or laminating fiberglass, HDPE pellets are melted and extruded into a tube known as a parison. Compressed air forces the hot plastic against a mold, forming lightweight interlocking panels with insulation built into their cores. Once delivered to the site, those pieces fit together almost like giant Lego blocks. A waterproof membrane can be placed over a gravel base. Puzzle-like floor mats provide insulation underneath. Then the lightweight structural panels are connected until the dome is complete. The process can be finished in a single day. The structure can be moved, the plastic is recyclable, and the material is highly impact-resistant. So whether you choose home-cast Aircrete, rapidly assembled fiberglass panels, or modular HDPE components, all 3 approaches share the same underlying idea: reduce dependence on the conventional building supply chain. Part 3. The Financial Paradox. $2,000 shell versus the $440,000 mortgage trap. Now we need to talk about money. Real money. Because for many people, the greatest threat to long-term independence is not a wildfire, hurricane, or electromagnetic pulse. It's the housing payment arriving every single month. The word mortgage comes from Old French and literally means death pledge. And for millions of people, that 30-year obligation becomes an anchor tying them to decades of full-time work simply to keep ownership of the place where they sleep. But when I say a microdome can cost around $2,000, we need to be completely clear about what that means. $2,000 is the raw shell, the structural envelope, the basic barrier separating you from rain, wind, and snow. It does not mean you receive a finished residence with beautiful floors, plumbing, electrical wiring, windows, furniture, and an approved building permit for $2,000. Turning that shell into a comfortable home requires more. You need a foundation or pad. You need a solid door. You need windows. You need basic plumbing and electrical systems. And you need a durable exterior coating such as fiber-reinforced stucco or protective paint. If you perform most of that work yourself, the final price might rise into the $10,000 to $15,000 range. If you move up to something much larger, such as a 1,000 square foot Aircrete dome built with professional assistance, total costs might reach approximately $32,000. Now compare those numbers with conventional alternatives. A professionally completed wood-framed tiny house on a trailer can cost somewhere between $80,000 and $150,000. A finished container home from higher-end builders, such as Boma Properties, may begin around $55,000 for a small 20-foot studio and climb beyond $125,000. A conventional modular home can average roughly $98,000 to $185,000 before you've even purchased the land or prepared the site. And then there is the ordinary stick-built suburban American house, roughly $440,000 up front. Finance that amount for 30 years at modern interest rates, and you may hand the bank more than another $500,000 in interest. By the end, you're approaching $1 million for a house that physically costs only a fraction of that total financial commitment to construct. So why does this paradox exist? Why would the market overlook a structure that appears capable of reducing housing costs so dramatically? Because conventional housing is not a single industry. It is a network of industries whose revenues depend on one another. Start with lumber. A conventional house consumes enormous quantities of studs, roof trusses, plywood, sheathing, and shingles. Those components age, they warp, they leak, they rot, and eventually, many of them need repair or replacement. A foam or Aircrete dome relies on a much smaller collection of materials designed not to rot, burn, or require the same form of structural replacement. From the perspective of the traditional lumber economy, the dome builder isn't a valuable repeat customer. Then come the developers. Their model works by clearing large tracts of land and repeating essentially the same house over and over again. One wooden box, then another, then another. A strange, round house, built largely by its owner, doesn't fit neatly into that high-volume, repeatable business model. And then, there are the utility and HVAC industries. A conventional square house can leak enormous amounts of heat through walls, roofs, windows, joints, and duct systems. Keeping that interior comfortable often requires expensive central heating and cooling equipment, complex ducts, recurring maintenance, repairs, and monthly utility bills. A thick Aircrete or foam dome can be insulated so heavily that a relatively tiny heater, or even the heat generated by occupants, can make a dramatic difference inside during cold weather. A house that demands almost no maintenance, little energy, and no mortgage interest doesn't generate the same lifetime stream of payments. The system doesn't necessarily have to outlaw the dome. It only has to refuse to value it in the same way it values the standard box. And that alone can push people back toward conventional construction. Part 4. The 13-Year Experiment. The Rise and Fall of Las Dome Village. If all of this still sounds like an idealistic off-grid theory, let me take you back to one of the most fascinating housing experiments in modern American history. In the fall of 1993, in the industrial heart of downtown Los Angeles, a very unusual community appeared at 847 Golden Avenue. It was created by Ted Hayes, a well-known civil rights and homeless activist. Hayes had spent years deliberately living alongside homeless people, sleeping on concrete, and experiencing the conditions faced by the people he was trying to represent. And he kept watching conventional shelter systems fail in exactly the same way. Huge warehouse-like rooms, long rows of metal cots beneath fluorescent lights, no private door, no wall that belonged to you, rules that often treated independent adults more like children or prisoners. Hayes came to believe that city planners were missing something fundamental. Some people were choosing cold sidewalks, doorways, or wet cardboard instead of shelters, not because they wanted to suffer, but because entering those shelters meant surrendering the last scraps of privacy and dignity they still controlled. So Hayes asked a radical question. What if the help itself was part of the problem? He eventually partnered with architect Craig Chamberlain, who had studied under Buckminster Fuller. Chamberlain designed a compact 20-foot fiberglass dome using intershelter technology. With corporate support from Arco, Hayes leased an abandoned gravel parking lot beside the roaring Harbor Freeway and erected 20 bright white domes. The project became known as Dome Village. The media called it golf ball city. But for the veterans, mothers, elderly people, and others who moved into those small structures, the domes represented something far more important. They were home. So what was daily life actually like? Residents described waking beneath a central skylight while soft natural light poured down across the curved interior. Because the dome had no conventional corners, there were fewer dark spaces tucked away at the edges of the room. When winter rain swept through Los Angeles, droplets tapped against the fiberglass shell. For people who had spent years sleeping lightly on the street, listening constantly for footsteps and danger, that rhythm became peaceful background noise. Some residents said they experienced the best sleep they had known in years. The village also became a self-governing community. Residents paid only about $70 a month in rent. In exchange, they developed their own rules. No violence, no drugs, no stealing, and everyone shared responsibility for maintaining the community. Residents swept gravel paths, repaired panels, worked in a community garden, attended computer literacy classes, and even created the Compton Cricket Club to encourage discipline and teamwork. But Dome Village was never perfect. Living in a circular building introduced very real inconveniences. Most furniture is rectangular. Push a square dresser against a curved wall, and part of the furniture remains several inches away from the surface, creating awkward, unused space. Photographs don't sit naturally against curved walls, and during hot summer afternoons, thin fiberglass shells could become uncomfortably warm, forcing residents to open doors and search for whatever breeze they could get. Sound was another problem. With relatively thin fiberglass separating each living space, people learned their neighbors' coughs, radio preferences, and late-night noises. Residents had a phrase for it: privacy for the eyes, but not for the ears. The village also lacked private kitchens and bathrooms. If an older resident needed to use the restroom at 2 in the morning during a cold rainstorm, she had to put on a coat, leave her dome, cross the dark gravel lot, and reach the communal facilities. Still, despite those compromises, Dome Village worked. For 13 years, hundreds of people passed through the community. For many of them, it became a kind of decompression chamber between homelessness and ordinary life. Give someone a door they can lock, an address they can put on a job application, and 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep, and something changes. They walk differently into interviews. They arrive differently at medical appointments. They interact differently with their children. So what destroyed Dome Village in 2006? Not crime, not structural failure, land rent. Dome Village never owned the ground beneath those structures. As property values surged around downtown Los Angeles, the owner of the parking lot increased the monthly rent by approximately 700%, from about $2,500 to more than $18,000. A charity funded largely by donations could not absorb that increase. The domes were dismantled panel by panel. Some were sold on eBay for roughly $3,000 each. Then they were scattered elsewhere. Ted Hayes was left in an empty parking lot, watching the city return to spending enormous sums debating a homelessness crisis that his relatively inexpensive domes had already begun addressing. Part 5. The 6 Monsters of Real-World Living, Hidden Engineering Disasters. By this point, you may be thinking, that's it. I'm building a dome. I'm buying land, grabbing a shovel, and getting off the grid. Not so fast, because if I only showed you the beautiful side of dome living and ignored the physical problems, I wouldn't be telling you the whole story. Before you stack a single block, you need to understand the 6 monsters of dome living. Monster #1, ultraviolet light, UV degradation. If your dome uses exposed expanded polystyrene foam, or if you leave Aircrete surfaces unprotected, sunlight becomes one of your biggest enemies. Ultraviolet radiation breaks down polymer chains in exposed foam. Leave that surface uncovered through a hot summer, and it can become yellow, brittle, and crumbly. The solution is simple but essential. Never leave the foam bare. Protect it quickly with a durable elastomeric acrylic coating, fiber-reinforced stucco, or stucco applied over reinforcing mesh. A relatively small amount spent on that protective layer becomes the permanent shield between your dome and the sun. Monster #2. The condensation trap. Mold. A properly constructed dome can be extremely airtight. That sounds wonderful. But airtightness has another side. Every breath you exhale releases moisture. Cooking adds moisture. Hot showers add even more. If that humid air has nowhere to escape, it eventually reaches cooler parts of the curved interior surface. Then condensation forms. In severe cases, water can collect overhead and drip down into the living area, creating the damp conditions where black mold can thrive. The solution is ventilation. Don't seal the dome like a pickle jar. Install a small active ventilation system or an inexpensive air-to-air heat exchanger so moisture can escape. The building still needs to breathe. Monster #3. Aerodynamic liftoff. The Frisbee effect domes can be remarkably lightweight. Their rounded aerodynamic form is one reason they perform so well in powerful winds. Air moves around the curve rather than crashing into a large flat wall. But the same curve can also behave like the surface of an airplane wing. Fast-moving wind can create a lower pressure zone above the structure. If the building isn't properly secured, that pressure difference can attempt to lift the dome from its foundation like an enormous frisbee. The solution is non-negotiable: serious mechanical anchoring. The dome must be securely tied to a concrete slab or connected to deep helical anchors driven into the soil. Monster #4. The hanging limitation. No studs. With a conventional framed wall, you can locate a wooden stud and attach a heavy cabinet directly to it. Aircrete and foam don't work the same way. You cannot simply drive an ordinary nail into the wall and expect it to support a 50-pound cabinet or heavy bookshelf indefinitely. Aircrete may have strong compressive properties, but concentrated pulling and shear forces can tear fasteners from the softer material. The solution begins before construction is finished. Plan the interior first. Wherever you know heavy cabinets, shelves, or equipment will eventually hang, embed wood backing blocks or steel mounting plates into the aircrete or panel system during construction. Monster #5. Wasted volumetric space. We live in a square-based world. Our couches are rectangular. Our refrigerators are rectangular. Our beds, cabinets, shelves, and tables are designed around 90-degree corners. Place those objects against a curved wall, and you naturally lose some usable floor space. The solution is to stop forcing square furniture into a round building. Built-in furniture becomes one of the dome's greatest advantages. Benches, shelves, storage spaces, and even countertops can be shaped from aircrete or built to follow the wall itself. Another approach is to keep the first several feet of the exterior wall vertical before beginning the inward dome curve. Monster #6. The permitting maze. And finally, there is the monster that destroys many dome projects before construction even begins: permits. Some local zoning rules require single-family homes to contain a minimum amount of floor space, sometimes 900 or 1,000 square feet. Those rules can make very small, efficient homes effectively illegal as permanent residences. The solution is to become a zoning detective before buying land. Don't purchase property first and discover the restrictions later. Research the county. Research the zoning category. Research the building department. Instead of attacking City Hall directly, find the path that already works within the existing rules. We'll look at exactly where some of those opportunities exist in Part 8. Part 6. Behind the Code Curtain. Who is protecting you, and who is protecting invoices? Why can a material like aircrete be widely used in places such as Germany and the United Kingdom, yet remain almost invisible in ordinary American suburbs? Why can a structure described as fire-resistant, termite-resistant, and capable of surviving major hurricanes still be treated as unacceptable by a local building inspector? To understand that, we have to look behind the code curtain. The International Residential Code, the IRC, forms the basis of residential construction rules across much of the United States. Open the prescriptive portions of that code, and you'll find familiar conventional materials dominating the system: poured concrete, dimensional lumber, masonry, light-gauge steel. When you move outside those familiar systems, you may find yourself dealing with IRC Section R104.11. That section allows local building officials to approve alternative materials and construction methods if you can demonstrate that they provide equivalent levels of strength, durability, and safety. And that word, demonstrate, is where the problem begins. Proving equivalency can become a financial gauntlet. You may need a licensed structural engineer willing to calculate the loads and stamp the design. That can cost somewhere between $5,000 and $15,000. You may also need accredited structural or fire testing, potentially adding tens of thousands of dollars and significant time to the process. The person trying to construct a $2,000 shell can suddenly face administrative and engineering costs many times greater than the structure itself, and supporters of alternative building argue that this barrier is not accidental. Large conventional material industries have money, organizations, and full-time representatives involved in standards and code development. Timber and fiberglass insulation companies can afford to send experts into those rooms. Small communities working with aircrete, straw bale, rammed earth, and other unconventional materials rarely have lobbying organizations with comparable resources. The story of Michael Reynolds shows how far that conflict can go. Reynolds is the architect behind Earthships, passive solar homes built using recycled tires, rammed earth, glass bottles, and other unconventional materials beginning in the 1970s. His goal was to create homes capable of drastically reducing heating and cooling demands while turning discarded materials into part of the building itself. But the system fought him. In 2000, the New Mexico State Architects Board revoked his professional architectural license and treated his unconventional designs as illegal and unsafe. Reynolds spent 17 difficult years pushing lawmakers to create a legal space for experimental construction. One of his most memorable arguments was simple. New Mexico had been willing to destroy thousands of acres of desert while testing an atomic bomb in the name of national security. So why couldn't the state allow experimentation with sustainable housing? Eventually, he won. In March 2007, the governor signed House Bill 269, the Sustainable Development Testing Site Act, creating a legal path for experimental construction methods to be tested. Then came the irony. In 2024, New York's Museum of Modern Art acquired one of Reynolds' original can bricks for its permanent collection. A crude building block made from recycled aluminum cans and earth. The purchase price was $4,500. A building approach that had once helped trigger a long battle over Reynolds' professional license was now polished, labeled, and displayed behind museum glass. And that brings us to the larger argument. The system doesn't reject alternative building only because of safety. Alternative buildings can also be difficult to meter, difficult to fit into conventional assessment systems, and less likely to generate recurring service contracts. A home that uses thermal mass to stabilize temperature and geometry to reduce energy demand asks much less from the utility company. It needs less HVAC equipment. It needs less repair. And if it is inexpensive enough to build without financing, it may need no 30-year bank loan. A home that needs very little cannot support an industry built around constantly selling you more. Part 7. The Free and Clear Blueprint. Build your safe haven in 3 days. If you want to move around this enormous, expensive housing machine, the answer is not necessarily to spend years fighting it. The answer is to build intelligently. Choose the right place. Choose the right system. And under the right circumstances, the raw shell of a microdome can rise over one exhausting but unforgettable weekend. Here is the 3-day free and clear blueprint. Friday. Prep the pad. Earth and gravel. A small microdome can be extremely lightweight, meaning you may not need the kind of deep, expensive, steel-reinforced foundation used beneath a conventional large house. Friday is about 2 things: getting level and staying dry. Begin by clearing roughly a 16 to 20 foot circle of topsoil. Lay down a heavy-duty vapor barrier so ground moisture cannot easily migrate upward. Then backfill and compact a level layer of road gravel, or pour a straightforward concrete slab, similar to the foundation you might use beneath a substantial backyard shed. The total can be only a few $100s in material, and one full day of demanding physical work. Saturday, the stacking day. The igloo Saturday is when the structure finally begins to appear. If you've already cast lightweight Aircrete blocks or prepared pre-cut foam components, the process becomes an enormous three-dimensional puzzle. Some modular foam panels weigh only about 175 pounds each. With 2 or 3 friends, the pieces can be carried, positioned, and connected without cranes, large framing crews, or highly specialized carpentry equipment. A simple central pivot arm can guide the dome's curve. The arm is anchored at the center of the floor and used as a physical compass while each layer climbs higher. As daylight fades, the final pieces meet near the peak. Once that last key section locks into position, the geometry begins working as a single structure. The shell becomes rigid and self-supporting. And for the first time, you're standing inside something that feels like a home. The wind is outside. You're inside. Sunday, skin and seal. The armor Sunday is when the lightweight shell receives its armor. The exterior can be wrapped in heavy fiberglass reinforcing mesh. Then a continuous layer of fiber-reinforced stucco or plaster is applied across the surface, with similar protective treatment used where required on the interior. That coating becomes the dome's protective skin. It shields foam from ultraviolet light. It keeps water out, and it adds critical protection against fire. Finally, the base of the structure is carefully sealed where the dome meets the foundation, so water cannot creep underneath. Then comes the moment that transforms the entire project from theory into something you can physically feel. Put a cheap thermometer inside. Close the door on a brutally hot afternoon or a freezing winter evening. Leave it alone. Then come back. Open the door. Step inside. Look at the number. And feel the difference with your own body. When the outside temperature barely seems to penetrate the still, insulated interior, you begin to understand why this geometry is so powerful. That first temperature reading becomes the payoff. Everything before it was an idea. That number is proof. Part 8. The Under-the-Radar Map. Where to find your oasis of freedom. But none of this matters if you cannot legally build it. So how do you avoid reaching Sunday afternoon, only to have a building inspector arrive with a cease and desist order? You learn the map. Building laws can change dramatically when you cross a state line, or even a county line. And some places in America have created far more room for owner-builders and alternative construction than others. Here is the under-the-radar map of freedom. Arizona, Cochise County. In Arizona's high desert, Cochise County became well known among alternative builders because of its owner-builder amendment. If you own qualifying land, the program can allow you to opt out of many standard residential inspections, with only a final safety inspection remaining. That gives an owner-builder considerably more control over how an unconventional structure is built. For someone interested in a dome, that can completely change the equation. Texas, the unincorporated counties parts of West Texas, offer another path. Counties such as Hudspeth, Presidio, Brewster, and Terrell have large unincorporated areas with little or no conventional residential building code enforcement. Rugged desert acreage can sometimes be found for roughly $500 to $1,500 per acre. In those areas, people may have far more freedom to experiment with unconventional structures without navigating the same level of residential red tape found in a suburban municipality. Colorado, Saguache County Descanes. Then there is Saguache County in Colorado's dramatic San Luis Valley. The area has developed a reputation among off-grid builders and people interested in unconventional housing. Alternative building is already part of the local culture, and experimental, environmentally focused structures are far less unusual there than they would be in a conventional suburb. New Mexico. The pioneer state New Mexico may be the most important example. It is one of the few states with explicit building code provisions addressing traditional and alternative materials such as adobe, rammed earth, and straw bale. The state has also offered sustainable building tax incentives. That proves something important. When the political will exists, alternative construction doesn't have to be punished. It can be encouraged. And if you don't live in Arizona, Texas, Colorado, or New Mexico, don't assume the answer is automatically no. Spend an afternoon becoming a zoning detective. Call the local planning department. Ask specifically about accessory dwelling units, ADUs. Ask whether your jurisdiction has adopted Appendix Q of the International Residential Code, which creates pathways for smaller homes. Ask what minimum floor area applies. Ask what alternative material provisions exist. The rules change everywhere. Your goal is not to spend years forcing a hostile county to say yes. Your goal is to find the place where the answer is already yes, and build your oasis there. The door out of the machine stand, outside your future dome with me for a moment. Imagine the scene. It's 4 in the morning. A violent winter storm is moving across the landscape. Sirens are sounding in the distance. Your neighbors are frantically covering windows and checking roofs. But you're sleeping inside a curved, seamless Aircrete shell built around a form associated with FEMA's highest level of storm protection. Inside, you're warm, you're dry, and you're completely calm. But the most beautiful part isn't the storm resistance. It's that the house is paid for. No 30-year banknote. No lender waiting every month for another payment. No bank able to take the key from your hand because you missed a mortgage bill. No enormous utility payment waiting in the mailbox. Every light outside might be flickering beneath a threatening sky, but inside your dome, everything is simply quiet. The $2,000 microdome is not really about some futuristic building gadget. It's a door, a possible way out of a system that expects people to work until they're old simply to finish paying for the box where they sleep. The shape itself has been hiding in plain sight for generations. It has been explored by the military, recognized by government agencies, built by engineers, used by activists, and repeatedly overlooked by industries that depend on enormous, recurring housing expenses. The foam costs pennies. Permission can cost a fortune. But now you know the door exists. If this video pulled back the curtain even a little, subscribe to Survival Roots and share it with someone who needs to know there may be another path. Sharing this knowledge is how we keep alternative ideas visible in a world that constantly pushes people back toward the conventional answer. And before you leave, do one thing for me. Look up the minimum square footage required for a legal home in your town, then put that number in the comments. Let's map exactly how high the wall is in every community, together. Until next time, stay safe, stay independent, and keep building your roots.